October 14th, 1066, Sussex. King Harold Godwinson stood atop Senlac Hill as the sun rose over the English countryside. Behind him stretched the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, perhaps 7,000 warriors standing shoulder to shoulder in tight formation. Below, assembling on the valley floor, came Duke William of Normandy with an army of similar size but vastly different composition. Harold had marched his army 250 miles in 9 days. They had just fought and won a brutal battle against Norwegian invaders at Stamford Bridge 3 weeks earlier. The men were exhausted. Many of his best troops hadn't arrived yet. But William was here now with his army, and Harold had no choice but to fight. What Harold couldn't know was that the next 9 hours would determine England's fate for 1,000 years. By sunset, he would be dead. His army would be shattered. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom would fall. The Norman Conquest would begin. This is the story of the Battle of Hastings. It's about how a defensive position that should have been unbreakable was broken. It's about how disciplined infantry fell to combined arms tactics. It's about how one arrow changed the course of English history forever. The story of Hastings begins with the death of King Edward the Confessor. On January 5th, 1066, Edward died without a direct heir. This created a succession crisis that would tear England apart. Edward had allegedly promised the throne to Duke William of Normandy years earlier. William was Edward's distant cousin and had hosted Edward during his exile. But deathbed promises, if they even existed, meant little compared to political reality. The Witenagemot, the Council of English Nobles, chose Harold Godwinson as king. Harold was the most powerful earl in England. His family controlled vast territories. He had military experience and political connections. Most importantly, he was English and present in England when Edward died. Harold was crowned king on January 6, 1066. This was either legitimate succession following Anglo-Saxon tradition or outright usurpation, depending on which side you believed. William certainly viewed it as theft of his rightful throne. But William wasn't the only claimant. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, also claimed the English throne based on earlier agreements between Norwegian and English kings. Harold was one of the most feared warriors in Europe. His claim had the backing of Harold Godwinson's own brother Tostig, who had been exiled from England and sought revenge. Harold Godwinson faced threats from north and south. He assembled an army and positioned it on England's southern coast to guard against Norman invasion. He maintained this position throughout the summer of 1066. The army consisted of the Fyrd, the militia levy that provided the bulk of English military forces. The Fyrd system required men to serve for limited periods. By September, harvest time arrived and the Fyrd needed to return home. Harold Godwinson was forced to disband his southern army. At almost that exact moment, Harald Hardrada invaded from the north. On September 1066, Harald Hardrada landed in northern England with a Norwegian army and Harold Godwinson's brother, Tostig. They defeated local English forces at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. York, the major city of northern England, was threatened. Harold Godwinson responded with incredible speed. He reassembled his army and marched north, covering nearly 200 miles in less than a week. On September 25, 1066, he surprised the Norwegian army at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a complete English victory. The Norwegian army was destroyed. Harald Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The survivors fled back to their ships. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegian invasion, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold had eliminated the Norwegian threat. But the forced march north and the fierce battle had exhausted his army. His best troops, the housecarls who formed his elite guard, had suffered casualties. The Fyrd militia had taken losses. Harold was celebrating his victory when news arrived that changed everything. William of Normandy had landed on England's southern coast on September 28th. The Norman invasion had begun. Duke William's army represented the cutting edge of 11th century military technology and organization. The core was Norman heavy cavalry, knights who would dominate European warfare for the next 2 centuries. A Norman knight was an expensive weapons system. He wore a hauberk of chainmail extending from neck to knees. This consisted of thousands of iron rings riveted together. Each hauberk required months to manufacture and cost a fortune. Over the mail, knights wore a conical helmet with a nose guard. Some wore additional padding underneath the mail for comfort and shock absorption. They carried a kite-shaped shield, nearly 4 feet tall, made of wood covered in leather and reinforced with iron. The primary weapon was the lance, a wooden shaft 8 to 10 feet long with a steel point. The lance was held underarm and used to charge into enemy formations. The combined weight of horse and rider, moving at a gallop, concentrated into the lance point, created devastating impact. Secondary weapons included swords, typically double-edged blades about 3 feet long, designed for cutting and thrusting. Many knights also carried maces or warhammers for fighting armored opponents, where blunt trauma was more effective than cuts. The horses, destriers bred for warfare, were themselves weapons. They stood 15 hands high, weighed over 1,000 pounds, and were trained to charge into infantry formations, to strike with their hooves, to bite and trample. A charging destrier could knock down men and create gaps in shield walls simply through mass and momentum. William's army included approximately 2,000 cavalry. These formed the elite strike force. But cavalry alone couldn't win battles. William also brought infantry and archers. The infantry numbered perhaps 4,000 men. They wore lighter armor than knights, often just padded jackets with some chain mail or leather reinforcement. They carried spears, swords, axes, and shields. Their role was to engage enemy infantry, to pin them in place, to create opportunities for cavalry charges. The archers, numbering perhaps 1,000, carried short bows or crossbows. Medieval archers weren't the longbowmen of later centuries. Their bows had limited range and power, but they could harass enemy formations, inflict casualties, and create disorder. William's army also included support personnel, engineers, and logistics troops. The total force numbered perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 fighting men plus support. This was transported across the English Channel in a fleet of hundreds of ships, a logistical achievement that demonstrated Norman organizational capabilities. Harold's army was built around a different tactical system. The core was the shield wall, a defensive formation that had served Anglo-Saxon warfare for centuries. The shield wall consisted of infantry standing shoulder to shoulder in tight ranks. Each man carried a large round shield, typically 3 feet in diameter, made of wood with an iron boss in the center. The shields overlapped, creating a continuous barrier. Behind the shields, warriors wielded various weapons. The most common was the spear, 8 to 10 feet long, used for thrusting over and between shields. Battle axes were popular among elite troops, particularly the 2-handed Danish axe that could cleave through shields and armor. Swords were prestige weapons carried by wealthier warriors. The elite troops were the housecarls, professional warriors who served the king and major earls. Housecarls wore chain mail similar to Norman knights, carried excellent weapons, and trained constantly. They formed the front ranks of the shield wall where the fighting was most intense. Behind the housecarls stood the fyrd, the militia levy. These were free men with military obligations to their lords. They provided their own equipment, which varied widely based on wealth. Some had mail armor and good weapons. Others had only padded jackets, simple spears, and shields. Training varied from regular practice to minimal experience. The shield wall's strength was defensive. Properly formed and disciplined, it was nearly impenetrable to frontal assault. Infantry attacking the shield wall faced overlapping shields, spear points thrusting from between shields, and axes swinging from the ranks. Cavalry charges could shatter against a solid shield wall, horses refusing to charge into the wall of wood and steel. But the shield wall had critical weaknesses. It was static and couldn't pursue fleeing enemies without losing formation. It was vulnerable to archery that could shoot over the shields into rear ranks. Most critically, if the shield wall broke or if warriors left formation to pursue enemies, the defensive advantage vanished. When Harold learned of William's landing, he faced a terrible decision. His army was in Yorkshire, over 250 miles from the invasion site. His men were exhausted from the march north and the battle at Stamford Bridge. Waiting to rest and gather reinforcements meant giving William time to fortify positions and ravage the countryside. Harold chose speed over caution. He ordered an immediate march south. The army departed Yorkshire on September 30th or October 1st. They reached London by October 6th, a forced march of nearly 200 miles in less than a week. In London, Harold gathered additional troops from the southern fyrd. But he didn't wait for all potential reinforcements to arrive. His brothers Gyrth and Leofwine advised waiting for more troops. Harold rejected this advice. He wanted to meet William quickly, before the Normans could establish themselves too firmly. On October 12th, Harold's army departed London, marching toward the Norman position near Hastings. They covered 50 miles in 2 days. On the evening of October 13th, the English army reached Senlac Hill, about 7 miles north of Hastings. Harold chose his position carefully. Senlac Hill was a ridge running roughly east to west. The northern side, where Harold positioned his forces, featured a relatively gentle slope that could be defended. The southern side, facing the Normans, was steeper. Marshes bordered the western and eastern flanks, limiting the approaches William could use. The position was strong defensively. Attackers would have to advance uphill while under missile fire, and then assault the shield wall at the crest. The flanking marshes prevented envelopment. If Harold's army maintained formation and discipline, the position was nearly unassailable. Harold deployed his forces along the ridge in a shield wall formation perhaps 600 yards wide. The housecarls held the center where fighting would be most intense. Fyrd militia extended the line to both flanks. His brothers Gyrth and Leofwine commanded the right and left wings respectively. Harold positioned himself in the center with his banner, the fighting man, marking the command position. The army settled in for the night. They knew battle would come at dawn. William's scouts reported the English position during the night of October 13th. The Norman army assembled at dawn on October 14th and began the march from their camp near Hastings to Senlac Hill. William organized his forces into 3 divisions. The Bretons, allies from Brittany, formed the left wing. Norman forces held the center under William's personal command. French and Flemish allies formed the right wing. Each division combined infantry, archers, and cavalry in coordinated formations. The Norman army reached Senlac Hill around 9 in the morning. They deployed at the base of the ridge, facing the English shield wall on the crest above them. The distance between the armies was perhaps 200 yards. Both armies paused. The soldiers could see each other clearly. The English shield wall stretched across the ridgetop in tight formation. Norman banners and pennants marked their divisions below. The silence before battle descended on the field. William addressed his troops. He reminded them they were fighting for their rightful king. He promised land and plunder to those who fought well. He warned that defeat meant death, as they were far from home with the English army blocking their escape. Harold addressed his troops. He reminded them they were fighting for their homeland. He called the Normans foreign invaders who had no right to English soil. He told them that if they held the shield wall, victory was certain. Around 9:30 in the morning, the Norman trumpet sounded. The Battle of Hastings began. The Norman archers advanced first. They climbed partway up the slope and began shooting at the English line. Arrows arced up toward the shield wall. But the English position on the hilltop meant most arrows fell short or were blocked by the overlapping shields. The archery had minimal effect. The shields provided excellent protection against arrows shot from below. The English casualties were light. After several minutes of ineffective shooting, William ordered the archers to withdraw. The infantry assault came next. Norman and allied infantry advanced up the slope toward the English shield wall. They climbed the hill in formation, shields raised, weapons ready. The English waited motionless in their defensive line. As the Normans closed to within 50 yards, the English began throwing spears and rocks. Some Normans fell. The assault continued. At 20 yards, the density of missiles increased. More attackers went down. The survivors pressed forward. The infantry lines crashed together with the sound of wood on wood and metal on metal. Norman soldiers tried to break the shield wall through sheer force. They stabbed between shields with swords and spears. They tried to hook shields down with axes. They pushed and shoved, trying to create gaps. The English held formation. They thrust spears over and between shields. They swung axes from the front ranks. They pushed back against the Norman pressure. The shield wall held solid. For perhaps 30 minutes, the infantry combat raged along the line. Neither side gained advantage. The fighting was brutal and exhausting. Men in the front ranks fought hand to hand while those behind pushed forward to maintain pressure or replace casualties. William then committed his cavalry. The knights formed up in the valley and charged up the slope toward the English line. The thunder of hundreds of hooves shook the ground. The lances came down into attack position. The destriers surged forward. The cavalry struck the shield wall like a wave hitting a cliff. Some horses balked at the wall of shields and men. Others crashed into the formation. Lances found targets. English warriors fell. But the shield wall held. The horses couldn't penetrate the tightly packed formation. Knights found themselves pressed against the shield wall, unable to break through. English axes and spears targeted the horses. Destriers screamed and fell. Knights went down, tumbling from dying horses. In close quarters against a formed infantry line, the cavalry lost their momentum advantage. The first Norman assault had failed. All three components, archers, infantry, and cavalry, had attacked the shield wall and been repulsed. William's forces withdrew back down the slope to reorganize. English casualties were relatively light. Norman casualties were significant. The time was perhaps 11 in the morning. The battle was 2 hours old. Harold's defensive strategy was working perfectly. William reorganized his forces and launched a second assault around midday. The pattern repeated, archers shooting with limited effect, infantry attacking uphill, cavalry charging the shield wall. Again, the English formation held. Again, Norman attacks were repulsed. Then something unexpected happened on the Norman left wing where the Breton division was engaged. The Bretons, after suffering heavy casualties for no gain, began retreating. What started as a tactical withdrawal became a rout. The Bretons fled down the hill in disorder. The English right wing, seeing the enemy fleeing, broke formation and pursued. The furred warriors on this flank abandoned the shield wall and charged down the hill after the fleeing Bretons. This was exactly the wrong thing to do. Once out of formation, infantry was vulnerable to cavalry. William saw the opportunity immediately. He ordered cavalry from his center to swing left and attack the pursuing English infantry. Norman knights crashed into the disordered English fyrd. Without the shield wall's protection, the individual English warriors were cut down. The Norman cavalry slaughtered hundreds of fyrd militia who had left the formation. The survivors tried to retreat back up the hill to the main English line. Many didn't make it. The Norman cavalry pursued them, cutting down stragglers. By the time the remnants regained the shield wall, the English right wing was significantly weakened. Harold had lost perhaps 1,000 men in this disaster. More critically, he had lost troops from one wing of his formation. The shield wall's strength depended on continuous line and overlapping shields. The gap created by the losses weakened the overall position. The incident also taught William a valuable lesson. The English would break formation to pursue a fleeing enemy. This created vulnerability. William ordered his commanders to prepare feigned retreats to draw more English troops out of formation. For the next several hours, from early afternoon until late afternoon, William's forces launched repeated attacks combined with feigned retreats. The pattern was consistent. Norman forces would assault a section of the English line, engage briefly, then withdraw in apparent disorder. Each time, some English warriors would leave the shield wall to pursue. Each time, Norman cavalry would turn and attack the pursuing infantry. Each time, English casualties mounted as troops caught out of formation were destroyed. Harold and his commanders tried to maintain discipline. They ordered the Fyrd to hold position no matter what. But the heat of battle, the adrenaline, the apparent opportunity to strike fleeing enemies, all worked against discipline. Warriors would break formation despite orders. The English casualties accumulated. The shield wall grew thinner. Gaps appeared that had to be filled by shifting troops from other sections. The tight formation that had made the position unassailable was gradually degrading. The Norman casualties were also mounting. The uphill assaults were costly. Each charge that failed left dead and wounded knights and horses at the base of the ridge. The infantry attacks exhausted the foot soldiers. The archers were running low on arrows. But William had a key advantage. He could rotate tired troops to the rear and bring fresh units forward. The defensive shield wall couldn't rotate. The same warriors who had been fighting since 9 in the morning were still in the front ranks at 3 in the afternoon. Exhaustion was setting in. The quality gap between the armies was narrowing. Harold's housecarls remained steady and effective. But the Fyrd militia, never as well trained or equipped, were wearing down under the sustained pressure and mounting casualties. By late afternoon, around 4 or 5 in the evening, the English position was weakening but still holding. The shield wall remained intact across most of the line. Harold still commanded from the center. His brothers still held the wings. Norman victory was not assured. Then William committed to one final all-out assault. Around 5 in the evening, William ordered every available soldier into a coordinated attack. Archers, infantry, and cavalry would attack simultaneously across the entire English line. This was the decisive moment. Either this assault would break the English, or William would have to retreat and abandon the invasion. The archers advanced and began shooting, but this time they changed their tactics. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they shot high, lobbing arrows in arcing trajectories. The arrows came down from above onto the English formation. This high-angle shooting was much more effective. Shields raised to block frontal attacks didn't protect against arrows falling from above. The English ranks behind the front line, previously safe from archery, were now vulnerable. Men began falling to arrow wounds. As the archery intensified, Norman infantry advanced up the slope. They hit the English line all along its length, engaging the shield wall in close combat. The English, under pressure from arrows and infantry, found it harder to maintain formation. Then the cavalry charged. Hundreds of Norman knights drove up the slope toward the embattled shield wall. The timing was critical. The English were already engaged with infantry and under arrow fire. They couldn't reform to properly receive the cavalry charge. The cavalry struck the shield wall in multiple locations. Some sections held. Others began to buckle under the combined pressure. Gaps appeared in the line. Norman knights pushed through, engaging the English from inside the formation, where the shield wall's defensive advantage vanished. The fighting became desperate. Hand-to-hand combat raged across the hilltop. The disciplined formation was fragmenting into scattered melees. English warriors fought in small groups, surrounded, vastly outnumbered at each point of contact, even though overall numbers were roughly equal. Somewhere during this final assault, either during the cavalry charge or from arrow fire, the records aren't clear, King Harold was struck in the face. The traditional account says an arrow hit him in the eye. Modern historians debate whether this is literally true or symbolic. What's certain is that Harold was killed during this final phase of the battle. Harold's death broke the remaining English resistance. When word spread that the king had fallen, the Fyrd began to flee. The housecarls, the elite warriors, fought on around Harold's body and his banner. They died almost to a man, refusing to surrender or flee. The Battle of Hastings was over. The English army was destroyed. The Norman Conquest had succeeded. As the English army broke, Norman forces pursued the fleeing survivors. Most fled north toward London. The cavalry hunted them through the gathering darkness, cutting down stragglers and isolated groups. One incident during the pursuit became known as the Malfosse, the evil ditch. A group of Norman knights pursuing English survivors in the dim light rode into a hidden ravine or ditch. Horses and riders tumbled into the depression. English survivors turned and attacked the disordered Normans. In the brief fight, several Norman nobles were killed before reinforcements arrived and massacred the English. The pursuit continued into the night and the following day. Norman cavalry ranged across Sussex hunting down survivors. English casualties in the battle and pursuit probably exceeded 4,000 killed. Norman casualties are harder to estimate, but were probably between 2,000 and 3,000 killed and wounded. Harold's body was found on the battlefield the next day, identified by his mistress Edith's swan neck. William initially refused to give the body a Christian burial, supposedly leaving it on the beach. Later accounts claim Harold's mother paid for the body's recovery, and it was buried at Waltham Abbey. The true fate of Harold's remains is unknown. Harold's brothers Gyrth and Leofwine were both killed in the battle. Most of the English nobility who fought at Hastings were dead. The Anglo-Saxon leadership class had been decapitated in a single day. William's victory at Hastings didn't immediately give him control of England. He marched to London but found the city defended. Rather than assault the walls, William marched around London, ravaging the countryside and demonstrating that no English army could stop him. English nobles began submitting to William as the reality of military defeat sank in. Edgar Atheling, a young Anglo-Saxon prince who had been proclaimed king after Harold's death, was abandoned by his supporters. On December 25, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, but conquering England required more than winning one battle and claiming the crown. For the next 5 years, William faced rebellions and resistance across England. He suppressed these revolts with brutal efficiency. Entire regions were devastated. The population was reduced through war, famine, and displacement. The harrying of the North in 1069 and 1070 was particularly devastating. William's forces destroyed crops, killed livestock, and burned villages across Yorkshire and neighboring regions. The goal was to create a wasteland that couldn't support rebel armies. The human cost was catastrophic, with estimates of deaths ranging from tens of thousands to over 100,000. By 1072, English resistance was effectively crushed. William controlled England. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was dispossessed and replaced by Norman lords. The English church hierarchy was replaced by Norman clergy. French became the language of the court and nobility. English remained the language of the common people, creating a linguistic divide that lasted centuries. The social transformation was complete. Anglo-Saxon England had ceased to exist. Norman England had been born. The Battle of Hastings was the hinge on which this transformation turned. Hastings offers valuable lessons in medieval military tactics and the interaction between offensive and defensive systems. Harold's defensive position was fundamentally sound. The hilltop location with marshes protecting the flanks made frontal assault difficult and envelopment nearly impossible. The shield wall formation was tactically appropriate for the position. Harold's mistake was not in positioning or formation, but in army composition and discipline. The Fyrd militia lacked the training and discipline to maintain formation under sustained pressure. When they broke ranks to pursue apparently fleeing enemies, they created vulnerabilities that William exploited. William's victory came through combined arms tactics and psychological warfare. He coordinated archers, infantry, and cavalry, to create multiple simultaneous threats. The feigned retreats were psychological operations designed to draw enemies out of strong positions. The high-angle archery in the final assault showed tactical adaptation and flexibility. The battle also demonstrated the power of heavy cavalry when properly employed. Norman knights couldn't break a formed shield wall through frontal charges. But when the shield wall weakened or when infantry was caught out of formation, the cavalry was devastating. This pattern would define medieval warfare for centuries. Technology played a role but wasn't decisive. Both armies had similar weapons and armor. The Norman cavalry had advantage in mobility and shock power. The English shield wall had advantage in defensive strength. The outcome wasn't determined by technology, but by tactics, discipline, and leadership. Harold's forced march from Yorkshire weakened his army before battle even began. His decision to fight immediately rather than wait for reinforcements meant he faced William with a tired, understrength force. These strategic decisions mattered more than tactical execution during the battle itself. Our knowledge of the Battle of Hastings comes largely from three sources. The first is the Bayeux Tapestry, a 230-foot-long embroidered cloth depicting the Norman Conquest from Norman perspective. Created within 20 years of the battle, it shows detailed scenes of preparation, the battle itself, and Harold's death. The tapestry is invaluable for understanding 11th century warfare. It depicts weapons, armor, tactics, and equipment in visual detail that written sources lack. But it's also propaganda commissioned by Norman patrons to justify the conquest. Harold is shown breaking an oath to William, making William's invasion a righteous punishment rather than foreign aggression. The second source is William of Poitiers, a Norman chronicler who wrote an account of William's life and conquests. Writing around 1071, just 5 years after Hastings, William of Poitiers provided detailed description of the battle. But he was a Norman partisan writing to glorify his patron. His account emphasizes Norman skill and courage while downplaying luck and English competence. The third source is various English chronicles written decades after the battle. These tend to emphasize English heroism and Norman brutality. They also contain legendary elements that may not be historically accurate. Modern historians piece together the battle's events by comparing these sources, identifying areas of agreement, and noting where bias or legend seems to distort accounts. The basic sequence of events is clear. The specific details, including exactly how Harold died, remain debated. The image of Harold dying from an arrow in the eye has become iconic. It appears in the Bayeux Tapestry, where a figure labeled Harold is shown with an arrow protruding from his face area. But the tapestry is ambiguous. The figure could be removing an arrow from his face, or could be a different person entirely. Written sources from shortly after the battle don't mention the arrow. William of Poitiers describes Harold being killed by knights in close combat. Later sources add the arrow detail. Some historians believe the arrow story is legend that developed in the decades after the battle. Others argue that the arrow story could be true, but wasn't emphasized in early sources because death by arrow wasn't considered noble or worthy of detailed description. Knights and chroniclers focused on close combat deaths as more honorable. The truth is, we don't know exactly how Harold died. He was killed during the final assault, probably late in the day. His death broke English resistance. Whether an arrow or a sword or a lance ended his life matters less than the fact that his death at Hastings ended Anglo-Saxon England. Hastings was remarkably close despite the decisive outcome. If Harold had waited in London for more reinforcements before marching south, he would have had a larger, fresher army. If the English right wing hadn't broken formation to pursue the Bretons, Harold wouldn't have lost 1,000 men to that cavalry attack. If Harold hadn't been killed in the final assault, English resistance might have continued into darkness and forced William to withdraw. If William had lost at Hastings, the Norman invasion would have failed. William would have been killed or forced to flee back to Normandy. Harold would have remained king. Anglo-Saxon England would have continued. The English language, culture, and institutions would have developed along different paths. The entire history of England, and by extension British history, North American history, and global history, would be different. The Norman Conquest was one of those pivot points where a single battle's outcome determined centuries of subsequent development. But William didn't lose. Harold died. The Anglo-Saxons were conquered. History followed the path determined by 9 hours of combat on Senlac Hill on October 14, 1066. The Battle of Hastings ended Anglo-Saxon England and began Norman England. The transformation affected every aspect of English society. The nobility was replaced. The church hierarchy was replaced. The language evolved into Middle English, incorporating thousands of French words. The legal system was reformed. Castle construction spread across the landscape. The Norman Conquest connected England more closely to continental Europe. Norman kings were also dukes of Normandy and later acquired other French territories. This created political connections and conflicts that shaped European politics for centuries. The 100 Years' War between England and France had roots in the Norman Conquest's territorial complications. The military legacy was equally significant. The combination of cavalry and infantry that William employed at Hastings became the standard European military model. The feudal system that supported this military structure spread through England following the conquest. Castle warfare became dominant as Norman lords built fortifications to secure their conquests. For English identity, the conquest created lasting complexities. English national identity emerged partly in opposition to Norman overlords. The linguistic divide between French-speaking nobility and English-speaking commoners persisted for centuries. The class associations of language, with French terms for prestige and English terms for common things, still echo in modern English. The Battle of Hastings became a reference point in English history. Every English schoolchild learns about 1066 and the Norman Conquest. The battle symbolizes foreign invasion, national trauma, and historical transformation. It's the last time England was successfully invaded and conquered by a foreign power. 950 years later today, the battlefield at Hastings is a tourist site. Battle Abbey, built by William on the battlefield to atone for the bloodshed, still stands though much modified from its original construction. The high altar supposedly marks the spot where Harold fell. Visitors can walk the ridge where the shield wall stood and look down the slope the Normans had to climb. The landscape has changed. Modern roads, buildings, and agriculture have altered the terrain, but the basic topography remains. The ridge, the slope, the valley, these are still recognizable from 1066 descriptions and the Bayeux tapestry depiction. Every October, historical reenactors stage the battle. Enthusiasts wearing replica armor and carrying replica weapons recreate the shield wall and the cavalry charges. These reenactments, while entertaining and educational, can't fully capture the reality of medieval combat. The fear, the exhaustion, the pain, the chaos, these aren't recreatable. The true legacy of Hastings isn't found on the battlefield, but in English language, culture, law, and institutions. The conquest's effects rippled across a millennium, shaping everything from vocabulary to property law to political structures. Modern England is built on the foundation that William established after Hastings. On October 14, 1066, as the sun set over Senlac Hill, it illuminated a battlefield covered with thousands of dead. The English shield wall had been broken. King Harold was dead. The housecarls had been slaughtered to the last man. The furred survivors were fleeing north in disorder. Duke William of Normandy stood victorious. He had gambled everything on this invasion. He had risked his duchy, his army, his life on one battle. He had won. The path to the English throne was open. Harold Godwinson had defended his kingdom with courage and tactical skill. He had chosen a strong position. He had fought intelligently. But he had been defeated by a combination of Norman tactical superiority, his army's discipline problems, and ultimately by an arrow or a sword that ended his life at the critical moment. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had existed for over 500 years died at Hastings. The warriors who had held England against Vikings and other invaders for generations were swept away in 9 hours. The military system that had served England for centuries proved unable to defeat the Norman combined arms tactics. Hastings demonstrated that defensive positions, no matter how strong, could be defeated by patient application of combined arms pressure. The shield wall that seemed unbreakable could be broken through sustained attacks, feigned retreats, psychological operations, and exploiting discipline failures. The battle proved that cavalry, properly employed with supporting infantry and archers, was the dominant military force of the medieval period. The mounted knight would rule European battlefields for the next several centuries based on patterns established at Hastings. Most significantly, Hastings showed that a single day's combat could determine a nation's fate. 9 hours of fighting ended one kingdom and began another. The warriors who died on Senlac Hill didn't know they were fighting at one of history's pivot points. They simply fought and died for their king and their cause. The thunder of hooves, the crash of shields, the cries of wounded men, all have faded into silence. The warriors who fought there are dust. The weapons they carried are museum pieces. The causes they died for are historical footnotes, but the consequences remain. England was changed forever. The English language carries Norman French vocabulary in thousands of words. English law retains Norman influences. English culture bears marks of the conquest. Modern England is Norman England's direct descendant, built on the foundation that William established after killing Harold and destroying the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And somewhere beneath the grounds of Battle Abbey, perhaps under the high altar or perhaps scattered across the hillside, lie the bones of King Harold Godwinson and his warriors who died defending Anglo-Saxon England on Coden Day, October 14th, 1066. They lost the battle, lost their kingdom, lost their lives, but gained immortality as the last defenders of a world that ended when the sun set on Senlac Hill. The day England fell was the day 9 hours of combat overwrote 5 centuries of history. It was the day the shield wall broke and the cavalry charge prevailed. It was the day an arrow or a sword found a king and changed the future of a nation. Hastings stands as eternal reminder that battles matter, that a single day's combat can reshape centuries, that courage and strength alone don't ensure victory, that tactical innovation and combined arms employment can defeat seemingly superior defensive positions, and that the fate of nations can turn on the death of a single man at the critical moment. The English learned these lessons in blood on a hillside in Sussex. The lessons echo across nearly 1,000 years. The Battle of Hastings remains studied, remembered, commemorated, because it was the day that changed everything.